Hi everyone, Angela here. In this video, I'm going to show you how I made my quilted placemat that's reversible with binding all around. And I'll teach you how to sew mitered corners that look great on both sides and how to calculate the binding to join them together at the ends. You can use this exact same method for other projects such as coasters, hot pads, table runners, and blankets. For this project, I'm using 100% quilting cotton that I've washed, dried, and pressed. First, I'm straightening out the bottom edge and removing the selvage from the side. Then I'm cutting a piece 20 by 17 inches. Fold the width in half, crease along the center fold, and open up again. I'm using a heat erasable pen to mark my quilt lines. First, I'll draw the center line, then mark lines 1.5 inches apart on each side. You can quilt this however you like. For the batting, I'm using 100% cotton with scrim. You can use another type of batting. I'm just using one layer of batting for this project. With right side up, place the fabric piece on top so that you can cut the batting 1/2 inch bigger all around. Then carefully put it aside. For the bottom of the placemat, I'm using a contrast fabric and opening it with the wrong side up. Place the batting piece on top and cut the bottom piece the same size as the batting, making sure not to include any of the selvage. I just have it poking out a little bit on the side. If you need to, use a few pins or safety pins to hold the layers together. Start stitching from the center, then stitch outwards on both sides. I'm using the Juki TL 2010Q sewing machine. The link for this and the tools I use are down in the description below. If you're in Australia or New Zealand, click the link for Echidna Sewing and Juki Junkies for North America. I'm increasing the stitch length to 3. Start and finish the stitch lines at the edges of the batting. There's no need to backstitch. My fabric is just stretching and puckering a little, so I'm going to switch from the standard presser foot to this walking foot to make it a little easier. It's also called an even feed foot. Using a walking foot helps feed the fabric layers evenly through the sewing machine. This will help keep the placemat shape and prevent it from becoming distorted. If you're finding this video helpful, make sure to like, share, subscribe, turn on all notifications, and leave a comment below. As always, I'd love to know where in the world you're watching from. You can also show your support by becoming a member. If you don't want to draw a lot of lines on your project, you can get a quilt guide for your walking foot. This one sits over my Juki foot and is adjustable here and here. Sew the center line first and then adjust the stitch guide to the spacing you want. Rest the guide on the line and continue stitching, keeping the guide on the previous stitch line. Using a quilt bar saves you time and keeps the lines parallel and evenly spaced. You can move the guide bar to the left-hand side along with the stitch guide and sew the lines working across to the right. I'll leave a link for these down in the description. Carefully trim away the batting, making sure the edges are straight and the corners are square. This next step is optional, but if you edge stitch or sew a narrow zigzag all around the edges, it'll make it a bit easier when adding the binding. Stitch about 1/8 inch from the edge. If you're zigzagging around, make sure the stitches aren't much wider than 1/8 inch so they don't show. The way I calculate for the binding, I first add the lengths of all 4 sides to get the perimeter, and then add the width of the binding strip, which will be 2.5 inches for this project. This is the minimum amount that I need. Measure how wide the fabric for the binding is without including the selvages. This is 22 inches folded, so it's 44 inches wide. I divide the length of the binding needed by the width of the fabric, and that equals 1.74, so rounding it off, I'll need to cut 2 binding strips. First, I'll straighten the edge of the fabric before cutting the 2 strips. 5 inches of fabric is needed to cut the 2 strips. Open one of the strips with the right side up. On the side, you can see little holes, and that's where the selvage is. We don't want to use any of that. With right sides together, place the other strip on top perpendicular to the first strip at a 90-degree angle. Overlap the strips so that the selvage edges extend past each side. Picture the square created with equal sides here. We'll sew the strips together on the bias, starting from this top corner down to this bottom corner. If you need to, draw a line from corner to corner, then pin together on either side. I'm now switching back to the standard presser foot. With the strips overlapped like this, it's really easy to see the corners. Push that corner right against the needle, then stitch across, backstitching at each end. Remove the pins, then trim down the seam to 1/4 inch and trim away the points on each side. On one end of the binding strip, trim away the selvage, making sure the edges are square. Press the seam open flat, then fold the binding in half lengthwise, matching the edges, and press across. Once done, open up the end without the selvage. Then fold up the end so it aligns with the side, creating a 45-degree angle. Press and leave the end open. If my fabric has a directional print, I prefer my binding join to be close to the center at the bottom. For the binding method I'm using, I start sewing from the back. I'm turning it lengthwise and then folding it in half to find the center. I'll just place a pin there to mark it. From the center, measure up about 5 or 6 inches and mark it with a clip. With the wrong side up, take the folded end of the binding and place it down with the angle on the right and the bottom edge of the fold in line with the center. Match the edge of the binding with the fabric, then measure down from the center 5 or 6 inches. Fold the binding over and clip in place. We'll start sewing the binding from this clip, then all around, finishing at this clip. I'll be using 1/4 inch seam allowance, and when stitching down towards the corner, I need to stop the stitching 1/4 inch before the next edge. If you need to, place a ruler across the bottom edge, measure up 1/4 inch, and mark across. Also mark the bottom corner. The stitching will stop at this mark and then pivot out past the corner. We'll start with a back stitch at that first clip. Just take note where your fabric edge is in relation to the side of your presser foot. You want to keep that consistent while you're sewing. Stitch towards the corner and stop with your needle down at that 1/4 inch mark. Lift the presser foot and pivot, then stitch to the corner and past it about 1 inch. Don't cut the thread and turn the fabric around. Now you don't need to do this, but I'm just pulling the thread out a bit more to show you more clearly how I'm folding the corner. Because you have this diagonal stitch line, it's really easy to fold the binding up and over against it so that the sides are in a straight line, the fold of the binding is parallel with the sides, and you have a 45-degree angle from the corner. On the folded side of the binding, place your fingernail at the top edge of the fabric and fold the binding straight down, matching the edges on the side. This top fold should be straight across and even with the fabric, and the sides should be all aligned. Again, there's no need to cut the thread, just start stitching again from the very edge, and you don't need to backstitch. If your fabric feels like it wants to pull to one side, just fold it over so it's a bit easier to handle. Another way to know where to stop with the needle down is by folding up the binding. Fold up 1/4 inch and crease along the fold. Stitch to the crease line and pivot to the corner. Once you get used to doing this, you won't need to mark the end at all. So whatever seam allowance you're using, stop that same distance before the corner. Finish stitching the binding about where this clip is. This is how the corners should look. And here's that bit of extra thread. Again, you don't need to trim it, it'll all get tucked inside. Smooth out the binding so it's nice and flat, then open up the folded end. Remove the pin from the center and pin it down on the left edge to hold it in place. Fold up the bottom corner and clip it in place so that it's not pulling. Smooth down the folded end so it's laying nice and flat. This corner should be 90 degrees and the edge going straight across. Place the other end of the binding on top while pulling it taut. Fold it straight up so that it's 1/8 of an inch from that straight edge, then crease it across. Cut the binding straight across the fold. Cutting the binding that little bit shorter will remove any slack. There's no extra measuring or wasting binding by cutting off a small piece to measure the width. Now fold down the top corner and clip it in place so it doesn't pull. Open up the end on top and align the edges on the side and bottom together. Lift the ends up together and you'll have the binding ends aligned correctly with the right sides together. The crease also shows you exactly where to stitch them together on the bias. Carefully hold on to it and remove the pin from below and use it to pin the ends together. Check your edges are even, then stitch right along the crease, back stitching at each corner. Trim the seam down to 1/4 of an inch. These two pieces are the only bits of waste from the binding. Remove the clips, press the seam open flat and in half again. You can see here the binding's just a little bit shorter, but when you stitch it together, it'll be nice and flat. Clip the edges together if you need to, and then stitch starting and stopping right over the original stitching about 1 inch on each side. You don't need to backstitch. Because the stitch line starts right at the top edge, when you flip the binding over the corner, it'll keep that center fabric inside to the left. Fold over all the corners and finger press along the seams to flatten them. Then turn over to the right side of the placemat. I don't press the seams with an iron yet. On the right side, a bit below the corner, fold the binding over right against the edge and clip to hold in place. Push in the extra thread, fold over the binding, and flatten the corner at the top. Pinch near the top edge and fold the binding down to create a mitered corner. Fold it right against the edge. Now you may have to try a few times with the corner to get it just right. Have the inner folds meet at the bottom and clip in place. I also want to mention that when the folds inside are facing the opposite direction on each side, there's less bulk at the corner. Clip to hold in place. When you're folding over the binding, check that the seam on the other side is nice and flat. Once folded snugly against the edge, the binding should cover well past the seam line. I'll just show you with the pin. If we stitch along here close to the folded edge, the stitching on the other side shouldn't catch the binding at all. It'll run just beside it. It'll look like the other quilt lines, or if you use a bobbin color that matches the fabric, it'll blend right in. If you need to, pin or clip all around. Take those two small end pieces to use as a leader and stitch across. This will help keep the threads from bird nesting underneath. Start with a back stitch close to the join. You can feel where the seam is on the other side, so make sure you're not stitching there, but closer to the fold of the binding. I'm aligning the fold with the center of the toe on the presser foot. At the corners, stitch right to the center seam and with the needle down, lift the presser foot and pivot. Continue stitching all around and finish with a back stitch. If you have a hard time edge stitching the binding, there's a special presser foot you can use that makes it a lot easier. This is a 1.5 millimeter or 1/16 of an inch left compensating foot. There's 2 separate feet that are spring-loaded to work with different thicknesses. The left side is thicker with a small groove to butt the binding edge against. The right side is higher to glide along the thicker layer with the binding. You'll find this is a real game changer as this foot is designed to help you sew very close and evenly along a raised edge. I'll also leave a link for this down in the description. Give it a light press to remove any quilt lines and you're left with a beautifully bound project that's fully reversible. Let me know down in the comments what your method is for attaching and joining binding and what you think of this one. If you enjoyed this tutorial, you can help support my channel by sharing and subscribing so I can bring you more like this. Special thanks to my wonderful members. I truly appreciate you. Thanks everyone for watching. Take care and happy sewing.